Every now and then I'm going to do these addendum videos, which give me the opportunity to attach some additional notes to one of our podcast episodes. As things develop over time, there are things that we learn. There's new material that we uncover. I'm learning, I'm developing. Sometimes there's things I just get wrong. I make mistakes. Sometimes there are things that need clarification. And just as an episode has been out, the same question comes up over and over and over again, and we start to realize, like, okay, we can add some clarification to that episode to clear up some of that confusion. And so you'll see me add these addendums in the show notes of some of these episodes. Today, what I wanted to talk about is this use of the term Pharisee. Conversation that we'll have in today's episode is excellent. It's very, very useful. The Pharisees are the Perushim are a very, very prominent part of our gospel narratives. And so having a good conversation about who they are historically, for the historical context of your gospels, is super, super important. Okay? I don't think we did anything off base in that regard. What I have come to appreciate more and more, and I was even appreciating even when we recorded this episode, but then even years later, I am refining my appreciation for something that happens in the Christian world when we talk about Pharisees that I wanted to address in a video today. We as Christians can tend to use Pharisee. I do this all the time. I am so guilty of this. So guilty. I use it routinely. It's become such a part of my personal nomenclature. Like, we use Pharisee as a derogatory term. Like, those people are being such Pharisees. It's a very Pharisaical mindset. That's Pharisaical. And what we're really doing is we're saying that's legalistic. That's anti-Jesus. That's anti-gospel. That's off base. That's so wrong. It's this derogatory, patronizing, like, quit being such a Pharisee. And we address, like, in today's episode, we address the things that are positive about what Pharisees are bringing to the table. But then beyond just the historical, we need to realize what we do to Judaism, like modern Judaism today, when we do this. I was confronted on this idea for the very first time from one of the tour guides, not one of my main tour guides, but there was a trip I took where I had to use a different agency and a different organization, and I had a different kind of tour guide. And the tour guide told me respectfully and gently, he said, "I'm so offended by the way that you talk about the Pharisees." He says the Pharisees were people that shaped our faith. They are our heroes in Judaism. And we had this great conversation. But what he said was absolutely true. Because the Pharisees, in the century or two that followed Jesus, when the temple was destroyed and Judaism shifted and evolved and changed, the Pharisees of the 2nd century were not the same Pharisees that are in place when we read our Gospels. The Pharisees evolved. The Pharisees changed. And the yoke that Jesus was pushing for, the yoke that Jesus was advocating for, the perspective, not in its entirety, not the complete Jesus worldview, but the yoke and the filter and the Hillel versus Shammai, the Pharisee movement moved in the right direction. And they really did. Like, after the destruction of the temple, the Pharisees literally saved Judaism. It's out of the Pharisaical movement that you will get rabbis with a capital R. When Jesus is on the scene, there are no rabbis with a capital R. There's just rabbis, and rabbis are just teachers. They're just teachers. It's not an ordained, formal. You might have a rabbi with shmicha. You might have a rabbi with authority. We'll talk about that later on in our podcast. but you don't have an ordained capital R rabbi. When the temple gets destroyed, Judaism has to figure out what's going to happen to Judaism. The central tenet of their faith was temple practice. What was temple observance, was the Levitical code and the Levitical priesthood, centering around temple worship. Now the temple's destroyed. What happens to Judaism? Well, Judaism ends up kind of restructuring itself around the rabbinical system. Well, who is that? It's the Pharisees. It's the Pharisees that will end up saving Judaism. Judaism only exists today because the Pharisees kept it alive, because they kept Torah, because they kept the teachings and the traditions, things like Talmud and Mishnah, and they codified all that, and they built up a rabbinic system of teaching and interpretation and rulings, and you can read about it in The Source by James Michener. If you get all the way to that point, it'll kind of walk through that whole period of history. That's the Pharisees. And so the Pharisees mean a lot to Judaism. And the reason that we as Christians often use the term Pharisee in such a derogatory way is because our conversation focuses on the ministry of Jesus. It focuses on a very thin slice of history, like a handful of decades that exists during during the days of the Gospels, the ministry of Jesus, and maybe the ministry of Paul, and those decades that follow the resurrection. Like, our conversation is focused solely on that part of historical Judaism. That makes sense. And when we only look at that field of study, that portion of history, we only see a certain part of the Pharisees. And what we need to realize is that the Pharisees existed a little bit before that, and the Pharisees existed for a long time after that. And to look only at that portion of who the Pharisees were on a larger level, maybe not for our biblical study, but we need to be aware of how the language that we use and how destructive it can be. Because the way we use the term Pharisee can be very destructive. It's not just offensive to Judaism. It can be very destructive. It actually holds up and propagates anti-Semitism. It propagates supercessionism. There are some words for you to Google and do some study on. It's very it can be anti-Semitic. It can really push forward a worldview that's very anti-Jewish. And I've come to appreciate that more and more. My world usually focuses on a very thin slice of that history, and that's understandable. And that's not necessarily, I think the historical critique of that period of Judaism isn't even inaccurate. I don't think we're even doing, but Pharisees, for especially Jews today, means something much bigger and wider than what we're usually talking about. Consider if people looked at your adolescence, at like just the period of the time when you were an adolescent, and judged you and who you are and your character by that period of your life. I know for me that would not be a good thing. I was somebody before I was an adolescent, and I definitely developed and evolved and grew and became somebody after my adolescence as well. And I wouldn't want somebody to just focus on one little thin slice of my history to define who I was. So we need to be careful when we talk about Pharisees that we don't do the same thing to Judaism. Let us not define the Pharisees themselves. Let us definitely not define Judaism, especially today in a modern sense, by looking back at a very thin slice of history for that particular group of people. So I've tried to stop using Pharisee as a derogatory, patronizing, almost name-calling sense. I've tried to get rid of that for so many reasons. But one of them is because of how it pushes forward a worldview that can be pretty destructive when it gets in the wrong places. So hopefully that's helpful. Beware of how we talk about Pharisees. Just beware of the conversation we're having and how it impacts conversations that lie outside of that. So hope that's helpful. Look forward to the next conversation. Thanks, guys.